Montana Territory. September 1884, the girl stumbled out of the tree line near the Yellowstone River, her dress torn, hair matted, and eyes wide with a fear that reached down into the marrow. She did not say a word. She just stood there barefoot, trembling, as the sun began to dip behind the jagged ridge of pine. Silas Steller reined in his horse slow, boots crunching dry leaves as he dismounted. He was 31, tall and broad, with a sun-darkened face and a quiet, steady way about him. He had been trailing a stray calf when he saw her, thin as a reed, arms clutched tight around herself like she was trying to hold all the broken pieces together. He did not ask questions. Not yet. Instead, he crouched a little ways off and said, "There's a fire back at my camp. Not far. You do not have to talk. Just come sit at my fire and breathe." The girl looked at him, her lips parted, but no sound came. She didn't nod, didn't shake her head, just watched him like he might vanish if she blinked. Silas stood slowly, keeping his voice low. "Do not worry. I will walk ahead, you follow behind. You can stop whenever you want." And she did. They reached the camp not long after, just a kettle over the coals and a bedroll laid out under a cottonwood. The river whispered nearby. Silas eased down onto a log and wordlessly handed her a blanket. She wrapped it around her shoulders, still saying nothing, and sat across from him. Her hands were scraped, her cheek bruised, and her eyes darted like a startled fawn's. She was young, 19, maybe 20. Not a child, but not far past it either. He stirred the beans in the pot. "You can have the bedroll tonight. I will stay by the fire." Still nothing when she finally slept, curled tight like an animal trying to make itself small. Silas stayed awake. He watched the shadows move across the trees and thought about the way she had flinched when a night bird cried. She stayed the next day and the next. On the third morning she spoke. "My name's Elodie." Her voice was barely above a whisper, raw like it had been sealed away too long. Silas looked up from where he was saddling his horse. "Good to meet you, Elodie." She did not say anything else, but she stayed. A week passed. She helped gather firewood, mended one of his shirts with her small, fast stitches, and listened to the river more than she ever looked him in the eye. It was a quiet rhythm firelight, river sound, simple meals. She never asked to leave, and he never asked her why she had come out of the trees with blood on her hem. But one night, when the wind kicked up and the fire danced high, Elodie sat beside him and said, "They are gone. My whole family. I do not have anywhere else." He did not press her, just handed her a mug of coffee and said, "You do not have to be anywhere but here." Her fingers brushed his as she took it. That night she did not sleep on the bedroll. She sat close to the fire beside him, blanket wrapped around both their shoulders. Silas didn't move away. 2 more days passed before she told him everything. Her father had owed money to a man who came collecting with 3 others. They ransacked their homestead near Miles City, shot her father, and dragged Elodie and her little sister out into the barn. Elodie had escaped. Her sister had not. Silas did not speak for a long time after she told him. He just stared into the flames, jaw tight. "I ran," Elodie whispered. "I ran and never stopped." "You did what you had to," he said. "You lived." Her eyes filled, but she blinked hard and kept them from falling. He cooked her eggs the next morning. They were a little scorched, but she smiled for the first time. He watched it happen like it was a sunrise. "I do not know how to be around people anymore," she admitted one night. "I do not know how to say things like normal." "You do not have to be normal," Silas said. "You just have to be real." She stared at him for a long moment. "You are the first person who has not asked me to explain myself," he shrugged. "Sometimes silence speaks the truth better." She kept looking at him. "You are different." "I have been told so," he said with a flicker of a smile. The days turned cooler. They rode together into town once for supplies. She stayed close to his side, clutching the reins like they might slip from her hands at any second. He introduced her to the general store owner as a friend. Elodie didn't speak much, but she held onto his sleeve when they passed a group of men too loud and too curious. "Back at camp," she said. "I do not like going into town." "You do not have to," he said simply. She nodded, and her hand brushed his as they unpacked the flour and coffee. That night, as the fire cracked and the stars came out, she leaned her head against his shoulder for the first time. Silas did not say a word. He just sat there with her, breathing slow, matching the rhythm of hers. 3 nights later she kissed him. It was quiet, unannounced, and so soft it almost did not register as real. But her lips touched his just once before she pulled back, eyes wide and terrified. "I am sorry," she whispered, already turning away, but he reached for her gently, hand on her wrist. "Do not be sorry." He kissed her back slow, sure, no rush in it. When they broke apart, she was crying for the first time since she had arrived. "I feel safe when I am with you," she said. "You are safe," he said, pressing his forehead to hers. "You are safe with me." They stayed by the fire until dawn. No more words, no more fear, just breathing. Together, the horses had grown used to her. Elodie moved among them with quiet steps, brushing down their coats with a patience that surprised even her. One of the mares, a dun-colored one with a white blaze on her nose, nuzzled her shoulder as she worked. She didn't pull away. Silas watched from the fence rail, arms crossed over his chest, a sliver of hay between his fingers. The herd had drifted down to the lower pasture, but the two of them stayed behind near the post corral, where the wind carried the smell of dry grass and the faint sharpness of cured leather. "You've got a steady hand with them," he said, not raising his voice. Elodie didn't stop brushing. "Animals don't expect anything from you. They just want to know you won't hurt them. People should be more like that." She glanced sideways at him, the wind tugging a loose strand of hair across her cheek. "Most aren't." Silas didn't argue. He stepped down from the rail and came to stand beside her, reaching to check the mare's hoof. "Townsfolk been asking about you." She stiffened just a little. "What do they want?" "Curiosity, mostly." "A few guesses too far crossed the line, but I set that straight." Elodie ran her palm down the mare's neck, slow and even. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." She glanced at him again. "Why did you?" Silas let the hoof down gently and stood. "Because you're not theirs to pick apart. And because I don't care for whispers." They saddled the horses and rode out to the upper ridge where the sun had warmed the rocks and the ground rolled soft beneath the hooves. Elodie rode ahead for the first time, her back straight, her braid trailing down her spine like a line of ink. Silas didn't say anything about it, but something eased in his chest watching her lead. They tied the horses near a notch of stone and sat on the flat shelf that overlooked the valley. The breeze carried the scent of pine and river, and below them, a hawk circled wide and slow. "My mother's family was French," Elodie said after a long silence. "She never spoke it around my father. Only at night when she thought we were asleep. She used to sing me lullabies in it." Silas leaned back on his elbows. "Do you remember any?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No. I only remember the sound of her voice." The wind picked up and carried her words out across the valley. "I was supposed to be married," she said. "Before. Everything. He was a friend of my father's, older, had a good bit of land. I didn't love him." Silas didn't move. "I said yes because it was expected, but I would have spent my life shrinking smaller every year." "You're not small," he said, his voice low. "Not anymore." She touched her shoulder where the mare had nudged her earlier. "I don't think I ever was. I just didn't know it." They stayed on the ridge until the sun dipped low. The shadows stretched long behind them as they rode back, and when they reached camp, Elodie unsaddled her horse without help. She didn't ask where to put the tack. She just did it. That night, she didn't sit on the same side of the fire. She sat beside him. I started dreaming again, she said, her voice low. Not the bad kind, just places, things I haven't seen yet. I dreamed about a house with a porch and flowers in the dirt. I was sitting on the steps, watching someone fix a fence. Were you alone? She shook her head. No, someone was just inside the doorway. I didn't see them, but I knew they were there. He didn't say anything. I think it was you. Silas looked into the fire. His jaw tightened, but not with anger. I've been thinking about building something north of the bend. Land's better there. Good soil, water close, enough timber if I haul it right. She folded her hands together, thumb brushing the edge of her palm. Do you want to do it alone? He turned his head. I don't. Elodie's fingers stilled. Then don't. They didn't touch, not that night. But when the fire burned down to embers and the moon was high, she leaned her head against his shoulder again. This time, his arm came around her slowly, settling with a firmness that told her it belonged there. Neither of them spoke again before sleep. They didn't need to. By late October, the cottonwoods had gone pale gold, their leaves loosening with the wind. Mornings frosted the grass white, and the horses breathed steam. Silas had started splitting wood after sunup, stacking it near the canvas tent he'd put up for shelter until they could build something better. Elodie came out wrapped in his wool coat, arms tucked beneath the lapels. She didn't say anything, just crouched beside the pile and began sorting the kindling from the thicker rounds. You don't have to do that, Silas said, setting his axe handle down in the dirt. I know. She worked without looking up, her movements careful. Her hands were rougher now, the skin across her knuckles marked with tiny scars from wood splinters and the slip of sewing needles. When she finally did glance over, her breath caught on the cold. I want to learn how to do it right, she said. Silas crouched beside her and picked up a split length of pine. You already are. She didn't smile, but something eased in her jaw. She handed him another log. By midday, they'd cleared the pile. Elodie leaned against the tent post and watched the smoke curl from the fire pit. Her cheeks were red from the wind and her braid had come loose at the end. Did you ever think about leaving Montana? She asked suddenly. Once, Silas said, sitting down beside her. After my brother died. She looked over, surprised. You never said you had a brother. I did. Older by 3 years. He was the one who came west first. Sent for me after he bought into a cattle share down near the Powder. Got himself shot over a dispute about fencing lines. Elodie's eyes lowered. I'm sorry. Silas shook his head. That was a long time ago. I stayed because I didn't see the sense in running from the land he chose. She pulled her knees up, resting her chin against them. I used to think I'd live my whole life without ever seeing anything else. Just dust and chores and doing what I was told. And now, I still don't know what comes next, but the quiet doesn't scare me anymore. He turned slightly, watching her face in profile. You've changed. She nodded, slow and sure. So have you. They sat without talking for a while. A hawk passed low overhead, its wings casting a sweeping shadow. Somewhere in the trees, a branch snapped under the weight of something unseen. Later, Silas brought out a ledger book with rough sketches of floor plans. He laid it on the flat stone near the fire and handed her a pencil stub. I've been thinking about the house, he said, but I haven't settled on where the windows ought to go. Elodie took the pencil and studied the drawing. The light comes from the east in the mornings. If you put the kitchen here, she pointed, you'd catch it with breakfast. He watched her trace the shape. You want a porch, she nodded. One with a bench. I'd like to sit and mend while the sun goes down. He added it to the sketch, his handwriting precise but faint. Anything else? A root cellar, she said without hesitation, and a place for drying herbs. He looked at her. We'll build it just like that. They planned until the fire burned low. She told him about the best way to keep mice out of stored flour, and he told her how to brace a wall frame so it wouldn't buckle with snow weight. Their knees touched as they leaned over the paper, and neither of them moved away. That night when they lay down inside the tent, there was only one bedroll. Elodie didn't pause before crawling in beside him. She tucked herself close, her hand resting lightly over his heart. "I want to stay," she whispered. Silas turned his face into her hair. "Then stay." Outside, the wind moved through the trees like water over stone. Inside, they slept pressed close, steady in the hush between their breaths, the future rising around them like a house just beginning to take shape. The lumber arrived in the back of a freight wagon driven by a Danish teamster named Lars, who only spoke when absolutely necessary. Silas helped him unload, stacking the milled pine boards beneath a canvas tarp stretched tight between two cedar posts. Elodie stood a few yards off, arms folded, watching the planks laid down one by one. She spoke as Lars drove off, the creak of oxen fading into the hills. "I want to learn how to square a beam." Silas dusted his palms on his trousers and turned. "You sure? It's slow work." "Every cut's got to be true." "I've done slower work with less meaning," she said. "Show me." They started with the corner posts. He showed her how to mark the notch with a scratch awl, how to steady the saw without forcing it. She wore gloves too big for her hands and narrowed her eyes every time the blade caught. By midday, her hair clung damp to her neck and her shoulders ached, but she didn't ask to stop. He didn't praise her, not directly. But when she set the final notch clean, he passed her the oil tin and said, "You'll want to rub the teeth before the next cut." She smiled, just faintly, and took it. That night they boiled potatoes with salt pork and ate beside the stacked boards, boots dusted with sawdust. Elodie pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and stared into the dark where the forest pressed in close. "I used to think a home was just walls and a roof," she said, not looking at him. "Now I think it's a place where no one watches you flinch." Silas didn't answer. He reached over, slid his hand into hers, and let the silence stretch long between them. By early November, the frame stood tall against the pale sky. It wasn't much yet, just ribs of timber and a rough floor, but it cast shadows now. They worked side by side, wordless most days, the rhythm of hammer and saw filling the space between them. One morning, a snow flurry dusted the ridge. Elodie came out with a scarf wrapped high around her chin, her breath clouding before her. She nodded toward the half-raised west wall. "I dreamed of that wall," she said. "There was a shelf on it and a row of jars." "What was in them?" "Dried peaches," she said, "and something red, maybe chokecherries." He looked at the bare frame and tilted his head. "We'll build a shelf there." "No," she said, a little smile tugging at her mouth. "I'll build it." Later that week, she found an old iron kettle in the back of the supply shed and spent the afternoon scrubbing it with sand and vinegar. When he came to check, he found her sleeves rolled high, face smudged with soot. "I'd like to cook something real," she said, rinsing the kettle. "Not just beans and salt pork, something warm that smells like a place people live." He leaned against the doorframe. "What do you need?" "Cornmeal." "Lard. Maybe molasses if you can trade for it." He left at daybreak the next morning, rode the 9 miles to town, and returned before dusk with a flour sack over his saddle and molasses wrapped in a rag. She didn't thank him. She just took it inside and lit the stove. That night, they ate cornbread with sweetened butter and sat on the floor beside the hearth, backs against the new wall. She rested her head against his shoulder and whispered, "I never knew it could feel like this." Silas turned his face slightly, brushing his mouth against her temple. "Like what?" "Like something is starting instead of ending." Her fingers curled into his shirt. They stayed there until the fire burned low and the stars flickered through the open rafters. When she finally stood, she held out her hand. He took it without hesitation and followed her to the bedroll laid out beneath the half-finished roof. There were no words between them, only the hush of breath and the warmth of shared skin. The wind moved outside, but inside, she didn't flinch. When morning came, she was still there, arm draped across his chest, her face at peace. He didn't wake her. He lay still, watching the light creep slow across the beams they'd raised together, and knew without question they were home. The first snow held off longer than folks expected. By Christmas Eve, the roof was shingled, the hearthstone set firm, and the windows fitted with thick panes traded from a glazier 3 towns over. The house stood square and sure on the rise above the bend, its porch posts carved with simple notches Elodie had etched herself small things. A leaf, a horse's head, a crescent moon, each one a mark of a life made by hand. Inside, the air smelled of pine smoke and beeswax. Elodie stood at the table, sleeves rolled to the elbow, flour dusting her forearms. A tin of dried wild apples sat open, and beside it, a small crock of honey they'd bartered for using one of Silas's hand-forged hinges. She was kneading dough for the pie she'd promised to make if the chimney held. Silas leaned in the doorway, watching her hands fold and press with a focus that reminded him of the way she'd once stitched a torn saddlebag without needing to be asked. "You always this stubborn about making everything from scratch?" he asked. "You saying it's stubborn to want something good in the world," she said, not glancing up. "I'm saying I'm glad for your kind of stubborn." She didn't answer, but her mouth tilted as she pressed the dough into the tin. That evening they ate by firelight, pie warm on the tongue, the kind of sweet that lingered. Elodie tucked her feet beneath herself on the bench, her chair drawn close to his. Outside, the snow had started at last, soft and quiet, covering the tracks they'd made earlier when she'd hung pine boughs over the porch rail. "You ever think about planting something in spring?" she asked, setting her fork down. "I was thinking beans, maybe onions. Something with roots. I want to try herbs, maybe lavender if the soil takes it." He nodded once. "We'll make it work." She reached across the table and brushed a crumb from his collar. Her fingers lingered, and when he caught them in his, she didn't pull away. "I didn't believe in this before," she said. "Not really, not for me." "You believe in it now." Elodie looked at the fire, its glow turning her eyes to amber. "I believe in you, and I believe in what we've built." "That's enough." He rose without a word and crossed to her, drawing her up from the chair. His hand settled gently at her waist, hers at his collar. "You're not afraid anymore," he said. "I still get scared," she whispered. "But not of you. Never of you." They stood like that for a long time, the fire crackling low. When he kissed her, her hands didn't tremble, her breath didn't catch. She leaned into him like she'd been waiting her whole life to be held without flinching. Later, they lay in the loft beneath a quilt she'd pieced from old shirts and flour sacks. Snow ticked against the roof, and the wind curled around the eaves, but the warmth between them held steady. "I want to marry you," Silas said, voice rough with sleep. Elodie didn't startle. She touched his cheek, her thumb brushing the stubble there. "Then ask me," he smiled into her palm. "Will you marry me, Elodie?" "I will," she said. "I already have in every way that matters, but yes. I will." They were married in March, when the ground softened enough for boots to leave prints again. The preacher came out from town, coat flapping in the wind, and stood beside the porch rail while Silas held Elodie's hand like it was something sacred. She wore a dress the color of river stone, sewn from a bolt of calico they'd saved for all winter. He wore the same shirt he'd worn the day they met, washed and mended at the cuffs. There were no guests but the wind and the trees and the pair of barn swallows that had started to roost in the eaves. Afterward, she set a loaf of warm bread on the table and poured coffee into the good tin cups. They sat across from each other, hands touching on the table between bites. "You feel different?" he asked. "I feel like I've stepped into something I can keep." In the years that came, the land grew with them. Silas built a small forge down by the creek, and Elodie turned the back room into a space for drying herbs and storing preserves. The garden thrived. The porch creaked under the weight of summer squash and wildflowers in jars. They never left Montana. They didn't need to. Every evening, they sat side by side on the porch bench, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting where it fit best, just beneath his collarbone. He told her once that his heart had never known stillness until she gave it to him. And she, who had run through trees with blood on her hem, never ran again. They lived long and well, and they loved each other every day.